Najee Harris, they have to decide between now and May 2nd whether to pick up his fifth-year option. He'd be designated to make about $6.6 million in the 2025 season. This one's tough for me because he's a professional. He stays healthy. He doesn't fumble the ball. I understand to start his career, Alfred Morris was the last player to have 3 consecutive 1,000-yard seasons. But the flip side I see is like, okay, 4.1 yards per carry this past season. His longest rush in his NFL career is 37 yards. He's a chain mover. He's not going to take one the distance from 50, 60 yards out. I'm very conflicted on this, but like if I'm being honest here, Chris, just the value position of a running back in the NFL, I think you could replace that level of production with another back to complement Jaylen Warren. And I will say this too, if you don't pick up Najee's fifth-year option for 2025 and then 2024 becomes a contract season, maybe that raises Najee's level of play. But what say you? How would you handle this? Or how will the Steelers handle this from Najee Harris's contract standpoint?
From everything I've heard, they're going to extend him. They're going to sign the fifth-year extension, particularly because it's not just what he brings on the field. It's that this guy's a leader. Like, there's so many times where, things weren't going right. Like Kenny Pickett took a hit, and the first person to get to him was Najee. Like, come on, Kenny, let's go. There was a time at the end of the Rams game where Chuks Okorafor is just mouthing off, doing something stupid, and almost gets a penalty, like getting into it with a Rams play. And you can even see some of the Rams defense like trying to egg him on to do something stupid so the Steelers get a penalty. It stops the clock, and then the kneeling out doesn't work. And who gets in the way? You see Najee Harris getting between them and just point Chuks, go, like get out of here. Like he has the leadership and respect of the locker room that I think that is a big factor. I also think that Najee Harris, like if we're being honest about, the yards per carry and the things and the numbers and everything, he hasn't had a good offensive line yet.
That's fair.
Like 2021, I mean, Kendrick Green was the set. Like that was the 2022 was below average offensive line. This was a year where I think that this was the closest you could say was an average line. And that's because Broderick Jones was placed in midway through the season, and he brought some energy to the group. But they still weren't consistent. Mason Cole was terrible this year. Brett Danmore was terrible this year. Sayamalu started slow, picked up, and got better throughout the rest of the season. James Daniels was solid. So you got a rookie who was raw but good. You have a good veteran at one position and a decent veteran at another. And then 2 bad players. Like, there wasn't much chances for Najee Harris to break things off. He broke as many tackles this year as Raheem Mostert for the Dolphins. The difference was Raheem Mostert had a viable passing attack that made it so no one could pay attention to him as much as, Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, and also had an offensive line that I think was a little bit more together. But when I look at Najee Harris, man, I see a guy who you give him that. He's viable. He is healthy. He's strong. And I think you're still only seeing the tip of the iceberg with him. And I said this last year. I said his first 3-year numbers are very similar to Marshawn Lynch and Derrick Henry's, who both started with not good offensive lines, were kind of figured things out. And all it took was a little bit of a passing game and a little bit of upgrade on the offensive line. And both those guys took off. I mean, Ryan Tannehill made the difference for the Titans. Derrick Henry became King Henry. Marshawn Lynch, go look at his numbers when he started to when he blew up. I'm not saying that Najee Harris is going to be Derrick Henry or Marshawn Lynch, but I could see him making the steps up that make, like, when you give him a better offensive line. I think the Steelers need to get a center and another tackle, right or left, and then figure out who's where at the end at the training camp, and have a kick butt offensive line, have a passing attack that's solid and efficient. Doesn't have to be elite, doesn't have to be top 10. Just make it solid and efficient, not bottom of the league. Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren will be a deadly duo next year with those 2 things added to the Steelers offense. That's why you sign him to extension. That's why you keep him around. And I think if he does well next year and you have that 5th-year extension on, you get that, you extend him for about 2-3 more years after that at a reasonable price, so it's not killing your team. But I think that you can live. Le'Veon Bell wasn't a home run hitter, but he was dangerous. And it was because he could keep hitting you all season long. And imagine those Steelers in the 2010s with a healthy Le'Veon Bell, the way that Najee Harris has been healthy for most of his career.
Several things here, Chris.
Sure.
The leadership, let's start there. he was a captain before this past season. Then you got to give it to the QB with Kenny Pickett. So it's like, in terms of the leadership there, I think that speaks volumes in terms of what he brings to the locker room, how he comports himself professionally too. That's not what I'm talking about in any criticism that I have of Najee Harris.
Yeah, sure.
You mentioned the tackle positions too. Dan Moore Jr. entering the final year of his deal. You're paying him only about $2 million. So even if he's, say, substandard as a tackle, that is tremendous contract value for a player who will make more money further down the line. But I also want you to think about this too, is if Najee Harris had outright made the Pro Bowl as a rookie, remember he was an alternate, instead of that $6.6 million figure for 2025, it would be about $10.1 million. And we're having a much, much different conversation right now.
We would be. Yeah, we would be. That would be kind of crazy to think about that. And $10.1 million, that is tough, especially on a team where you're doing a lot of rebuilding. You want to make other signings. But at 6.6 right now, I think that is a great number that Omar Khan will happily lock down. And here's another thing. Let's see how he performs next year. And if the offensive line does take steps forward, or if there's a whole new direction to the offense, because that's the other thing. If someone comes in as an offensive coordinator and all of a sudden this becomes a good passing offense, not saying it's going to happen, but again, let's say we're exploring all the possibilities and the run game becomes less important, then you might not need a Najee Harris. Maybe you say, hey, you know what? He's not the focal point. We don't need to pay him as much. We'll keep Jaylen Warren and go get some guy in the draft after that. But I think right now, with the way that they're building, the way that they've wanted this team to become, I think that Najee Harris is a very important part of that. Also, while he doesn't have 50-yard runs, he does have the fourth most 15-yard runs in the NFL this year, only behind McCaffrey, Gibbs, and Henry on the season.
I see what you're doing there, Chris. And I know since he came into the league week 9 and on, he has like the most yards week 9 and on since he came to the NFL in the 2021 season. And we'll see. Like I said, I mean, how all of this plays out, you could kind of see some inklings about this when they were trying to work out Saquon Barkley's deal. And it was like, man, this is going to be a tough negotiation. Again, it's not Najee as a player. It's just the positional value of running backs in the NFL.
Agreed. It's a tough spot.